Joan's been involved in a lot of.
Yeah.
She made the Clangers.
Yes, well, the Clangers idea came from a book that Oliver wrote in the Nog series, where a spacecraft landed in the font in the courtyard of the castle, and splashed down, and out of it came this little moon mouse, and it was called Noggin and the Moon Mouse. When the BBC asked us to think of a space series, that seemed to be an obvious thing. Oliver said, well, let's take the moon mouse, bring it up to date, and find out all about its life and that. So we investigated various ideas. Several names came up, but when we realised they lived inside a planet where they went down the tunnels and they had saucepan lids for their lids of their tunnels, and they brought them down with a clang. We said, oh, they're the Clangers. So that was the name which we invented for that. And then, we had to sort of decide what they looked like. And I had to make I made skeletons, and Joan, my wife, knitted the skins. I was never very good at finding real materials for things. I tended to use what's around or recycle things. I mean, people think that Oliver and I are the great sort of founders of the recycler movement, but in fact it was mainly because I'm mean and I don't, instead of buying a piece of material, I'd find the old bit of things that are around and use. I mean, Mr. Pogle's little smock is probably a piece of little skirt that was probably one of the girls when they were little, and smocked it and made it into us. So that was it. That's why we had this sort of habit of recycling things. And so the saucepan lids were their lids, and and the idea of the iron chicken. Well, Oliver came up with this idea of an iron chicken. Where did it live? Well, it sort of lived in a nest in space. So we looked around. We had a good day tidying up our studios. We'll put everything together in a great bundle and tied it up with wire, and I sprayed it silver, and that was the iron chicken's nest. It was, there were bits of vacuum cleaner, pipe, and bicycle chains, all sorts of things in that nest. And of course, the new people that are making it now, they had to copy find the new things to replace those old things that I'd made in those days, which probably ended up on the dump somewhere.
I just wanted to briefly touch on Basil Brush, who I suspect many people perhaps aren't aware that you created him, and what an extraordinary sort of afterlife he's had.
So I made this fox. He was not named. I mean, he wasn't named then or anything. He was I just thought of him as rather a jolly hunting, shooting, fishing fox. Sort of, the sort of character. I made the puppet. I got a bit of teddy bear cloth and a real fox's brush I used to make the tail, and made this fox. And I made a little hedgehog who was Wally White decided it was a Scottish hedgehog, so he was named Spike McPike, and the fox was named Basil Brush. Anyhow, so Basil Brush eventually got his own program, and he was very popular, especially as he was such a chatty, smart aleck characters who always working with humans who tried to tell him stories, and that series went on for 6 weeks at a time over several years. But the lucky thing for me was, because they couldn't afford to pay me to make the puppet, they said, we'll pay you £6 every time he's used. So I never actually sold him. He was always mine, and so Basil Brush brought me in this rent all the time. And but of course, eventually, he didn't have any work at all, and then he's become recently having his own show, but it's a different puppet now, made anew and quite different, really, I think. But still, I've still got a little stake in it. Rumour Godden had written a story about the doll's house, and we were asked to animate that. So I made a doll's house and some dolls, and they were that was a short series about the story of the doll's house, which kept Oliver busy then. I'd been to Windsor. We'd seen this little doll in a doll's house, and I got a letter from a lady who said she owned a doll that was only a half an inch tall, and it had broken, its limbs broken, and could I try to mend it? Because she'd seen the Rumour Godden story, the Totty and the Doll's House, which I'd made dolls for, because the main character in Totty was actually a Dutch doll, you know, with joints, wooden joints. So she sent me this tiny doll, and it was only about an inch tall or something like that, and it needed a new joint, so I managed to mend it. And then I thought I'd make a copy of it. So I made a copy and thought, this is a great idea, what terrible things might happen to a tiny doll that size. And I thought, well, she needs a partner. So I made another little one, a little black sailor doll. And one day I was messing about with them and dropped him, and Joan vacuumed him up into the vacuum cleaner. Before I knew anything about it, she'd emptied the vacuum cleaner bag, and there was Victor, he was called, had disappeared. So we managed to empty the dustbin and find him, and I cleaned him up and he was all right. But I thought it was a great idea for a story. So I wrote a story about this little doll, the sort of adventures that they might have, and they lived in a little China doll's house, and sold it to Andre Deutsch, the publisher, and they said, and the first story ended up, they ended up, happily on the mantelpiece in their little doll's house, but something terrible might have happened, and the editor said, "That's a good phrase. You must use that on every book. Something terrible might have happened," as the ending of every book. And so what I did really, but that's the story of my life. Something terrible might have happened, but it didn't. So that was really a Pinny. And I did 5 books of that, and went to see Cynthia Felgood at the BBC with this book and said, we'd like to try to make a single frame animation film of these, and she bought it, and we did a series of Pinny's House on BBC Children's. It was only ever shown once because it was very basic. I mean, it's a bit late in the 80s, to be doing this simple animation with single frame bits of cardboard. But we quite enjoyed it.
I mean, it's a terrible phrase, but did you fall out of fashion effectively when it came to
yes,
children's television?
Well, we fell out of fashion after Bagpuss because we wanted to make more Bagpuss, but the BBC said, no, puppets are not really in it now, and we want, they did Play School and those things where humans larking about in the studio, which I always thought was a bit undignified, doing silly little things in the studio and pretending to be children. But no, they preferred humans, actors, to do these things, and they thought puppets were, we want to get back to reality rather than this imagination thing. So we never made any more Bagpuss.
Well, they must be kicking themselves.
Well, yes, I mean, it would have been nice, but I think we had run our course really. After all, you think, we'd been doing it for 30 years. Lots of new ideas, and that was 80s, early 80s. So I think we'd given our all. People say they're influenced. Even Nick Park says he was influenced by seeing Ivor the Engine and thinking, oh, I could do that. In fact, that's, I think, main thing that I think is valuable about doing simple animation is that children can watch it, and it's not just there's this magic thing on television, but no, they're seeing something happen and they now can actually do it themselves. I mean, we've seen so many of these little bits of animation that children have done, and they can do it with the sort of digital equipment nowadays. They can do it. Whereas I've never animated a thing in my life, really. I mean, when Oliver gave me the chance of animating a bit on one of the films, because he was getting fed up with doing something, and I had to go, and I couldn't do it. I haven't got the patience. Animation, and yet, when I think of being awarded various things for my contributions to animation, well, but my contribution is for cut price cardboard cartoons.
Wow. But look what it added up to was
yes,
was
I mean, everything.
special.
Yes, there's a Yes, there is something there that because Oliver and I were innovators in our own way, struggling against the odds, then what we managed to do with very limited thing does inspire people a bit. And you know, there are things, almost accidental things, that happen when you're working in that way that do produce quite exciting results.
What advice would you impart to students at UAL, for example, who might wish to pursue a career in illustration?
Well, I think mainly is, you know, don't go after the cash, because, you know, it never works that way. Produce things that your own self, when you were younger, wouldn't be ashamed of. And I think the main thing is just to remember what you wanted to do in the beginning, and never be unfaithful to your own ambition.